Like a glove.
I came away from the last video with my faith shaken on this E30 project, to be honest. It was a huge blow to me to realise that the car was actually nowhere near drivable, nowhere near ready for its MOT, and much further back than I actually thought it was. It even planted some seeds of doubt about some of the modification decisions I decided on and have already implemented to the car. What was in the last video was also just the start of the problems, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, let's talk about some potentially good news regarding the clutch. So after the heartbreak of finding out that the clutch slips on this car's shakedown run, the old man and I jumped underneath the car to start with the first and most obvious potential problem, which is the slave cylinder. We whipped the slave cylinder off. When we'd taken off the slave cylinder, we discovered that there was nothing obviously wrong, which was a shame because it would have been nice to find a smoking gun, and we simply bolted it back on. After that, we put the car back down and took it for another quick spin just to get really clear on what the symptoms actually were with the clutch slipping. But believe it or not, the clutch did not slip after that, which is miraculous because we didn't really fix anything. I don't want to celebrate too early, but right now I have high hopes that the clutch is absolutely fine, and maybe there was something strange about the slave cylinder after all. Maybe the rod was just not located properly on the pivoting arm. Hopefully we'll find out whether that clutch is really fixed later in this video, so make sure you keep watching to find out about that. In other good news, we also had a play with the throttle. If you remember, I was complaining about the throttle pedal feeling like an on-off switch and being really snatchy when I'm trying to put in light inputs. We loosened it right off and had a play with the routing of the cable, and it has improved it, but it still doesn't feel good to me. But I think the problem really is my brain is just not calibrated to a cable throttle like this, which is quite heavy, along with the light and flywheel. All of that exacerbated by the really short ratio diff, which is an unsustainable ratio. I think in time, I'm going to get calibrated to it a bit more, and it won't spoil the experience of driving this car, so I'm feeling a lot better about that as well. Despite those two wins, I did have another unfortunate discovery during this car's post-drive inspection. When we jumped underneath the car, I noticed there was black grease up the length of the underside, my immaculate grey underside that I painstakingly refinished. It turned out that that was actually black CV axle grease, and one of the drive shafts, the one on the passenger side, has pinholes in one of the ends and is slinging grease up the car. I was really quite upset about that, as you can imagine. So I ended up getting straight under there with half a can of degreaser and some hot soapy water, and I can confirm it's immaculate again. But I didn't even take a picture, which in hindsight was foolish, because it would have definitely given you a laugh. Sorry about that. After that cleanup operation was done, we turned our attention to the steering. If you remember, there was a really loud jolt through the steering wheel when you passed a certain range in the steering, in either direction. It turned out that I was correct. The tie rods were catching on the undertray that I'd fitted. Quite annoying. It's definitely due to the fact that the position of the front control arms and the position of the wheels have moved a bit to correct for the 5 lug swap, to recenter the wheel in the arch using those SRS concept front control arm bushings. But we can work around it. And what I've done is I've trimmed on both sides a little half moon into the tray to give clearance for the track rod ends to go left and right. And it seems like at any suspension setting now, it clears. So hopefully that means that one's solved. I'll run some clips of that now so you can just see in exactly what way you've modified it. Because if you're making a very similar build to this, you will need to be aware of it, it turns out. Before I go ahead and put that under tray back in, I'm going to just see if I can tweak the alignment a little bit. The front of the driver's side wheel is out a bit, and the front of the passenger side wheel is in a bit, which explains why the steering's off. I'm going to get it just tweaked so it's a bit better, and I'll get it properly tracked. As you can see, the trimming went very well, really quite happy with that. I'm sure it solved it. While we were down there, we decided to have a little go at the tracking as well, which was all over the place, noticed in the test drive. And I think from eyeball again, it looks much improved, so that's good. The trouble is, while we were down there, we spotted something else wrong with the steering, which is potentially much more serious and definitely an MOT fail. We saw little black marks on the chassis rail on both sides where the tyre is contacting it, which must be happening when the steering's on full lock or near full lock. But in investigating that to see how much it's touching, we raised the front of the car up and steered it all the way left and all the way right, and realised that the rim is actually contacting the front anti-roll bar when you're on full lock. To me, that has the potential to be catastrophic. For example, you could lock a wheel at some point while you're driving aggressively, and that could be terminal for the car and potentially the driver. Maybe I shouldn't be too surprised about that, because we are running a slightly larger wheel, having done the 5 lug swap, and we have changed the steering rack to a Z3 one, all in previous videos if you're interested in finding out about those in detail. But lots has changed on the front, so problems like this are probably guaranteed. But I couldn't help, when I noticed it, feeling like the car was actually kicking me whilst I was down. Luckily, the old man gave me a bit of a pep talk and explained to me that this is actually just the nature of working on a project like this. You should see some of the issues he's having with his bikes in our other videos. Maybe interesting to you if you want to check those out as well. But I'm feeling ready to have another charge at this car now and see if we can get it over the line. First thing I want to deal with today is that slinging drive shaft. I have a very sweet solution to that, and we'll crack on with it now and I'll show you. So these half shafts are actually the original ones to the car, and I've noticed they were a little bit scruffy before, but they don't make any noises and there's no clunks or grinding or anything like that. So I ended up just giving them a blow over in black and hoping they'd be just okay for a while. Evidently not. The pinholes are in this area here. They're quite hard to spot, and you can see that some parts of them are just rusted off, and that's where it's slinging grease from. So I ended up with grease in a line all the way up the underside of the car, which was really irritating. Hopefully what I have here is a nice pair of brand new SKF drive shafts. Let's crack these open. Well, they look really good. These weren't actually as expensive as I was expecting them to be, and they should be great quality because they are SKF, which is a well-known bearing manufacturer known for quality bearings, and that's what really counts on these shafts, because the actual shaft itself isn't really known to fail. From my research, people have had a good experience with these particular drive shafts, and the only complaints I found were about people getting sent the wrong type. But to me, these do look correct, but we'll only really know for sure when I remove one of the original ones and we have them side by side. I'll definitely be checking very closely before I do anything with them to make sure they're still returnable. There it is. Well, with them side by side, it definitely looks like we're onto a winner with the SKF ones. I'll link to where I got these in the descriptions. They were actually a really good deal. You might want to pick some up yourself. I'm sure there are nice cheap rebuild kits to recommission these and change the boots and change the rusty end caps. But in the interest of getting this car on the road, I decided not to mess around and go straight for new ones. And I'm so over budget on this build already that what's an extra couple of £100? The spline ends are both 40mm, and you will notice that the SKF ones have the ABS ring on and my original ones don't. Now the rear arms I've got are actually from an ABS car, so there are holes, and hopefully what that means is these are interchangeable, and the fact it has this shouldn't matter at all. As for where my original one was leaking, you'd think it'd be leaking out of here where the cap has completely rusted away, but it wasn't. It's actually leaking from a couple of pinholes that are just on the back of this side. This is the diff side. And the pinholes were enough to allow it to sling grease when obviously it's rotating under the car. So that would have been a bit of a pain to change or fix. So to be honest, I think I'm glad I've gone with new ones. I've saved myself a bit of frustration. As for shaft diameter, the SKF one seems to be 27mm. The original one, bit of movement there, it's, I'd say, 26. I was expecting them to be just the same. The SKF one is marginally thicker by 1mm. Probably not a bad thing. Right, without further ado, let's get these SKF ones on. Having a little bit of trouble getting the diff side connected up, and it's because the boots on the SKF ones are slightly chunkier, which makes getting the screws through difficult. So what I'm going to do is get them most of the way through on the bench, and then hopefully when I take it back to the car I can get the threads to bite. Round 2. The hub nut torques up to quite a high level. The sources vary between 200 and 250 Newton meters. I'm going to torque mine up to 200 this time, and then if I decide I want to top them up later, I always can. But it gives me a nice excuse to use my new big torque wrench, which I haven't used properly yet. Well, that's how you replace an E30 half shaft. So I'm going to now do the passenger side, which has the added complication of the exhaust being in the way, so I won't show it in as much detail. Hopefully it'll be just as sweet as this one. Well, that was very successful and much easier than I thought. Very happy. And with that, let's get the front of the car jacked up and I'll show you the problem with the wheels touching the wheel wells. This black mark was the first thing we noticed, but let us show you what it looks like with the wheel turned at full droop. So now, hopefully you can see what I mean. When the car is loaded on its suspension, the tyre can very slightly touch the chassis rail in the wheel well, which is unfortunate. But when the car suspension is at full droop, like it is now, the alloy wheel rim can actually contact the anti-roll bar and the tyre touches the chassis rail a lot. I'd go as far as to say that was dangerous. It could cause a lockup. Now, it would be very unusual to be at full lock and at full droop at the same time, but it's not impossible. My cunning plan to solve that is to fit some steering rack limiter spacers onto the end of each side of the steering rack, which will stop the lock from being as extended. Now, that seems a bit backward to me, because on a car like this, generally you want more steering lock so you can catch any back end action. But we've got to do what we've got to do to make these wheels fit correctly. I will show you exactly how I'm going to do that now. Let's head to the bench. This piece of aluminium tube is the solution I've got. Now, this isn't the steering rack that's for the E30. The one that's on the E30 is a Z3 rack. See that in a previous episode. This one's actually is a purple tag rack that's destined for something else, but it's going to enable me to show you what I mean. I'm going to take the boot off. So, this is the rack and the pinion, which turns with the steering column, and the rack goes side to side to steer the wheels. This is the inner tie rod, and if I add a spacer into here, captive between the inner tie rod and the inner part of the rack, it should limit how far the rack can move left and right. Obviously, granted, I'd have one on both sides. So that would limit how far the rack could move into the body of the steering rack, left and right, which should mean I get a bit less steering angle, preventing the tyres from touching the wheel well. There are actually certain types of washers that have a spacer on that BMW sell to limit the steering racks. I think they're used on certain models of Z3. They're quite expensive, even though I did look at those, but the problem is, who's to say that they're actually the right size for my application? So I had to kind of discount them. I got the calipers out and I measured the diameter of the actual rack on the Z3 steering rack a while back, which is when I ordered this tube. The inner diameter of this tube is 27mm, which should match the one on the Z3. This purple tag one seems to be a mil thicker, so it's about 28, so you'll be to bear that in mind if you're using a different rack to me. The wall of this tube is 4mm, which seems a bit small to me. I'd have liked more, but this is what I could get. I will link to this in the description, and obviously you're about to find out if it works. I'm confident that it will. So the only thing left in question is how big of a slice do I actually need to cut off this aluminium bar to make a spacer. I'm expecting something around 5mm probably. I'm going to get under the car, I'm going to take the rubber boot off, and then what I'm going to do is steer the rack all the way to one side so that the rack's at its shortest point, which won't be fully seated because the wheel's hitting the wheel well. I'm then going to measure the gap between the seat in here and the end of the rack, which should give me the starting point. And then I'm going to back the steering off slightly to a point where I'm comfortable that the wheel's not touching, which will extend this rack out slightly more, which will then give me my total spacer size that I need. No doubt that's going to be incredibly awkward to show you under the car, but hopefully what I've just explained there does make sense. I'll let you know what we get to. We'll reconvene when I'm cutting this. Okay, so using the E46 rack as an example again, I have drawn up what I was doing underneath the car because it turned out to be very difficult to measure the gap that was left when the wheel was on full lock. So what we ended up doing was we measured the big nuts, which turned out to be 33mm, both sides. Then we measured the gap, using the end of the caliper, which turned out to be 21mm on the driver's side, but strangely 27.5mm on the passenger side. Don't know why they weren't even, but that's good to know. From there, we could measure the poke out of this nut to tell us what gap was remaining when the wheel was on full lock for both sides. Once we had our gap size for both sides, I then went and backed the steering off to give about 1.5 centimetres of clearance between the alloy and the ARB, which I felt was safe, and then re-measured the poke out. The extra poke out I got needs to be added to the gap that I originally calculated to give us our spacer size for both sides. Like a glove. Right, the spacers are on now, but it ended up actually being quite a bit more of a faff than I anticipated. The first spacer, the one on the driver's side, went on beautifully. The passenger side one wouldn't go on for love nor money, so we ended up using a round file to just make it a bit slacker, and eventually it went on, but it was quite a faff. Once I'd done that, I realised, having buttoned it all back up, that I'd made the spacers too large, which was unfortunate. So I had to take them off, and we did a bit of back and forth. The driver's side one ended up being 8.5mm, the passenger side one ended up being 8mm dead on. Bear in mind, if your car's a left-hand drive, the steering rack's different, so you need to do some trial and error of your own. But for me here, that's just what's worked. I'm quite happy with it, and it's a lot safer. There's a good centimetre of clearance each side at worst case scenario, so I'm not worried about the wheel locking anymore, which is excellent. And before you rush to comment, I know the front brake lines are too long. I might add a cable tie or something to just pull the line away from the wheel, but I'm definitely going to be replacing them to shorter ones at some point in the future. Right, so that's the rubber boots back on the steering rack. Hopefully that's the last time I have to mess with those for a while, because they're horrible and greasy things. Now, before I take the car on another test drive, just to make sure my drive shafts and my steering mods are good, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the opportunity to swap in a new coding plug to correct the RPM on my instrument cluster. Some of you have noticed that the revs are reading wrong since I switched in a 6-cylinder engine into the car, and that's because the plug that's in there currently is for a 4-cylinder. This is a replacement for that, which should correct the revs for a 6-cylinder car. Slots in just underneath the instrument cluster after you take a few things out, which we're going to figure out now. Let's get to it. The coding plug lives just underneath the cluster around this area, so what we need to do is remove some trim. First things first, we'll need to take this one off. Take the bezel off that surrounds, and if you haven't already, you'll need to remove your knee roll so you can get behind it all. First bit of trim to remove is this lower one. It's a bit loose on this side of mine. There should be 2 thumb screws behind this, which you can access up through here. One of them's missing, which is not ideal but convenient in this case. Let's see if I can get this one off. I can't. This is what they look like. And with that removed, it's now revealed 4 screws along the bottom there. And of course, we've got 2 additional screws at the top of the bezel, which I now need to take out. They're just Phillips head. There we go, that's the bezel. Right, now we can see it. So this is where the coding plug lives. And it should come out if we pinch these 2 tabs in and just give it a little wiggle. There we go. Right, these look very different right now. That's because the coding plug actually lives inside this plastic container, let's say. It's got a bit of a door on the back, which we need to open to switch the new one in. So there's a little locking pin there, which I'm going to just cut so that we can open this door and switch them over. Okay, so now the chip should slide out of here. Push it in the bottom. Perfect. Right, let's put it back. Alright, let's get that trim back on. Job's a good one. Right, and I'll put this broken knee roll back in as well. Right, now, let's take down another short test drive, find out if today's work has actually been successful. Well, I'm pleased to report that it's very positive news following that test drive. My drive shafts seem really sweet, no problems. The steering jolt does seem to have been solved by trimming the undertray, which is great news. My eyeball alignment has improved the handling quite a lot. The car is no longer trying to steer into the nearest ditch. The chassis rails don't seem to be contacted by the tyres on full lock anymore, which again is a big upgrade because that would have probably been an MOT fail. My RPM gauge is even reading the correct RPMs, which is also quite nice. The biggest surprise of all though is the clutch is no longer slipping, which is just insane to me. I was even giving it some real welly on that test drive as well, having let the engine warm up of course. But even when I'm trying to provoke the car and redlining the car, the clutch doesn't slip. It's a miracle. I suppose in my experience this is exactly how it goes when you're working on cars. You've got to always expect the unexpected, whether positive or negative. But thank you very much for all the comments I received. I had some really good leads on what might have been causing the clutch to slip. Some people suggested I might have put the clutch disc in the wrong way around, which had me looking back at my footage. Another good query was whether the clutch that I put in was actually a 2.5 litre clutch rather than the 2.0. I didn't know there was a difference. Looking back on my purchase history on eBay, it does look like it's definitely a 325i clutch, so I'm hoping I can rule that one out as well. But either way, it's not slipping right now. I'm going to be quite sensitive about the clutch for a while, no doubt, and I will be reporting back if it starts to slip again. But as it stands, I have two theories on why it might have been slipping on that initial test drive. The first theory is that it was down to that slave cylinder, which, to be honest, I was hoping it would be when I initially had the slipping problem. Because all we've done is taken off the slave cylinder and put it back, and that alone seems to be the only difference between the two test drives, so maybe it's what fixed it. It might indicate that the rod that actually comes out of the slave cylinder was not returning somehow, so it was keeping the clutch slightly released, which may have been why it was slipping, and just taking it off and putting it back on may have solved it, which would be unusual, but anything can happen. The other theory I have is that maybe the clutch ended up with some contamination. It was in storage for quite a long time. So one thought I'm having is, did it get something like WD-40 on it? When I fitted it, I did wipe it over with brake clean, but maybe it had got oil on it that had soaked into it more than a wipe over with brake clean could have removed. And maybe just doing a few miles in the car has actually burned it off and now it bites again. I'm not really sure. Maybe one day we'll find out, but right now I'm very happy. Thank you very much for watching. Next time if you tune in, we should be seeing if we can correct those headlights and tidying up anything else I think the car needs to be able to pass its MOT. Make sure you subscribe so you can see how that plays out. Thank you very much.